Hello, everybody. It is 9 o'clock on Saturday night, and I am Chris Weuve, and this is Starfleet Tactical on the Aries Studio channel. So thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm actually flying solo this evening. I do not have Lissa backing me up, so things should be okay. But if there's a little hiccup, that happens every now and then. But tonight I'm going to be talking about it doesn't immediately appear it, but it's actually a follow-on to the previous ones on the Belknap and the Athabasca and the Ascension class, in that while researching those topics, I rediscovered something that I had previously seen and went, that's interesting. And it led to me thinking about a whole bunch of different things that I'm going to talk about tonight. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides. Thank you for Eric Henry says nice shirt. So that's it's the Bu9 shirt. I was one of the people that was helping David Weber do technical background in this series, and so I used to actually do this for the Honorverse, the sort of stuff I do here. So that's one of the two Honorverse shirts I have that I wear. Actually, I've got a couple of others, but these are one of the two official Bu9 shirts. So we're going to talk about the Brownwood class assault transport, or assault tug, it's also called. But that got me thinking about canon and head canon in Star Trek, and it got me thinking about fleet design, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to use the Brownwood class as sort of a way to go off on those topics. As always, I am not talking for anybody other than myself. It's not the opinion of any of my employers, et cetera. All the images I use are the property of the people who actually produce the images. I try to, in this case, I'm trying to cite who that is. It's mostly just a couple of websites that I'll talk about in a moment. And I certainly don't want anybody to not enjoy something because I'm not here to tell you not to enjoy something, right? I'm here to try to make your enjoyment a little bit more knowledgeable, but I don't want anybody to not enjoy something. Okay, so the schedule going forward, the 1st and 8th of August, I'm thinking I'm going to do shows. There's a possibility I might not on the 8th, because there's a possibility that on the 8th I will be playing a war game instead. After that, on the 15th, I'm expecting that I will be doing a trip to the Strategic Book and Game Reserve located at Beaver Valley Self-Storage in Beaver Creek, Ohio, to pick up a load of stuff and to sort of prep stuff for my brother, DeLon, who's going to be passing through a few days behind me. And then on the 21st, I'm having surgery, so I'm going to be hard down on the 22nd. I expect to be hard down on the 29th also. And I'm also expecting to be hard down on the 5th of September. So it's possible that the 5th of September might happen. It's possible. Basically what it comes down to, it's abdominal surgery, and so it comes down to, can I sit? If I can't sit, I can't do the show. If I'm still stuck horizontal, then I won't be able to do it. And then I'm not sure what the topic's going to be next week, let alone going forward after that. So, but I'll figure it out. I always do. So here's our agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk about the Brownwood class and sort of where it evolved from. So we've got the Ptolemy class to our right here. That's the old version from the Franz Joseph design, the Star Trek Starfleet Technical Manual from 1970, whatever, 75, 74, 76, something like that. And this is designed to carry cargo pods. You can see it's got that tow pad, and it's designed to carry cargo pods on that tow pad, containers. And so we'll look at the Ptolemy class a little bit. We'll look at the Brownwood class, which is this assault transport tug, and I'll tell you why I'm so enraptured with it. We'll compare it to the Miranda class. The reasons why will be obvious in just a moment. And then we'll look at some of the container options and sort of speculate a little bit on what containers might look like in this universe. And in addition to that, then we'll talk about sort of the nature of canon and head canon and things like that. And then after that, a little bit about fleet design and that Brownwood implications. I'm actually covering that up above. In fact, I thought I had deleted that from that location, or maybe it's still there. I can't remember. exactly what I did with this slide deck. So we'll figure it out together. So this on the right-hand side is the thing that we're talking about, the Brownwood class assault tug. And I rediscovered this while researching the Belknap and the Athabasca and all the rest of it. And it was in a couple of sources. It was in the Star Trek Starship Tactical Combat Simulator website, which is the old website supporting the old FOSSA game. And it was also in Jekyll's Starfleet Reference Manual, Ships of the Fleet, Volume 1. In fact, Eric Christensen, the author of that, is the originator of the Brownwood class. And so apologies in advance, because all the stuff that came out of the Jackal's manual, it's all from Cygnus X1 from the Jackal stuff, but it's very low quality scans. And the lines and the printing of that book, it was never the crispest stuff to begin with. And the low res scans hasn't made it any better. And so everything's a little bit fuzzy. But I asked myself when I rediscovered it, it's like, this seems like such a natural thing. You add a couple of toe pads to what looks like a Miranda, and it gives you the ability to carry cargo containers. And so it's like a minimal addition. Maybe you have to reroute the turbo lift a little bit internally. So, I mean, maybe it changes things internally, but I look at this and I go, why isn't this the default design? Why aren't all of the Mirandas like this? And that in turn got me seriously thinking about Canon and head Canon and fleet design and all those other things. So we're going to touch on those issues later on. The Star Trek Tactical Combat Simulator website frequently pulls from other sources, including Jackal's. So like sometimes they redo artwork. Sometimes it's just, where they got it from. And in their case, they got it from the Jackal stuff. So there isn't really, this is as good an image as we get. But it's also kind of interesting. One of the things I will do when I'm looking at stuff like that, on the FOSSA site, I'll compare the various things. Like, okay, so I've got a Miranda and I've got the Brownwood. Do the stats look vaguely the same? And I'm thinking mostly physical stats, like size and things like that, because and I figured they're going to be internally consistent. So are they internally consistent with each other? Like, for instance, just as a heads up, the Miranda and the Brownwood have the exact same weapons fit. They've got 6 regular phasers. They've got the 2 mega phaser installations, and they've got 4 photon torpedo tubes. Exact same weapons fit. And then I also do the same thing with Jackals, because there's the stuff internal to Jackal's implementation of it. And so I compare Jackals to Jackals. Now, I don't put a whole lot of stock on things like how many phasers it has, et cetera. I generally don't bother getting into the weeds on all that stuff, because importantly, a lot of that stuff is like beauty and specifications are in the eye of the beholder. If somebody's just making it up, I don't want to get wrapped around the axle over, did that guy make up the right number? I think I want to take a bigger picture view of it, because there is no authoritative source. So I'm not going to get wrapped around the axle about the non-authoritative sources. So from that standpoint, I didn't bother to even compare, other than I noticed that the weapons fits were the same and the lengths and the dimensions were approximately the same. I really didn't look at anything like what was the top speed and how fast could it get there, et cetera. Because like Jackals in particular gives you like speed to various warp numbers. And I just didn't get into any of the details on that, because that's not really what this is about. Okay, so here's another look at the Ptolemy class, both in its classic configuration on the left-hand side. So the drawing is from the lower left drawing is from the FOSSA site. The upper thing, I just found that, I can't even remember the name of the site, but it cited that it was done by the Red Admiral at trekmania.net. To be honest, I didn't go to trekmania.net to take a look at it. But when I went looking for Ptolemy class images, found a bunch of them that were all sort of like this, and it sort of gives you an idea of what that configuration looks like. On the right-hand side, this is from the FOSSA website, because they didn't have a Franz Joseph iteration of it, but what they did have was a follow-on movie era implementation of it with the movie era propulsion system involved, and showing you how it would carry a cargo container that way. Now, theoretically, these cargo containers are stringable. You can carry multiple cargo containers. Like, I think for every mount point, they theoretically can carry 3. They sort of magnetically clamp together. That strikes me as being sort of crazy, that you would just use a magnetic clamp and do a big train of them. It seems to me asking for trouble. But at the very least, you can always carry one if you wanted to only carry one, and your warp performance would be better with that. One thing to notice between the difference between the classic Ptolemy and the refit Ptolemy on the right-hand side. The refit Ptolemy has torpedoes. You can see the torpedo tube there right above the tow pad. And it's also got a recessed navigational deflector in the lower half of the primary hull. Now, if you go back and you look at the Franz Joseph stuff, if you go back to the slide a couple of the slides ago where I showed you the Franz Joseph stuff, it has it labeled as main sensor, because remember that dish was always listed as being a sensor until Next Gen Tech Manual came out. I think was when we first started seeing that main dish. It might have been with something involving the motion picture, but at some point they started calling it the navigational deflector, and that it sort of crystallized into the idea that the navigational deflector is a subspace device. It's basically another warp field generating device that's sort of tied in with the warp engines, and it's used to sort of clear the space in front of the ship. We knew that they had navigational deflectors because I believe that Whitfield talks about it in the making of Star Trek. But we didn't. But it was only later that this is labeled as being a navigational deflector, and so I'm skeptical looking at the old Ptolemy design. I'm skeptical that that's a meaningful warp device. Just this dish all by itself, just sort of hanging out there without anything sort of behind it making it work. So from that standpoint, I mean that sort of hints at the issue that you run into with Canon is that over time, Canon changes, and sometimes it invalidates things that came before. Now, this was never an official design, although I think that maybe some of the Ptolemy-class ships show up in some of the movies and sort of screens in the background. I don't think we actually see a drawing of one, but I think we see names and hull registration numbers that match other sources, implying that they were pulling non-Canon sources into the Canon, which happens all the time. But you sort of look at this and you go like, this doesn't really sort of fit with our current understanding of how this works. And so that leads you to an interesting question. Like, do I just ignore it? I mean, we know some of the stuff got pulled in. So the ship names and registration seem to apply. How do you process that in a situation where it no longer makes sense? And we're going to talk about that later on in the episode. Okay, so moving on. So this is the Brownwood class, all right? So this is the same illustration as before. I just chopped it up so that I could make it a little bit bigger. As you can see, it looks like a Miranda class with 2 tow pads to connect containers on. And you can see that, they just sort of tuck in quite nicely underneath there. The claim is that it can tow up to 6, 2 rows of 3 each. That seems excessive to me, and I would perhaps argue that you would only do that in certain situations. But Jackals references this as an assault tug, an assault transport. It's not like it looks like it's based on the Miranda. We'll get into that in just a second, but it doesn't actually say anything about this is a Miranda derivative. In fact, that was one of the weird things about it. In the write-up, it doesn't mention the Miranda at all, where it's like, this is clearly based on a Miranda. It looks like it's based on a Miranda. So let's look at 2 questions. First of all, is that actually a Miranda? Let's do a little in-depth comparison. And does this idea even make sense? Right? I mean, I've often said that, I don't like designs where they just start adding like warp engines everywhere, and where you don't know how the warp plasma gets to a place, and the secondary hull isn't connected, and the only way to get to the secondary hull is to either use a transporter or crawl down a Jeffries tube, or so does it have any failure modes like that? So first of all, let's go ahead and ask the question, is it a Miranda? Yeah, the short answer is yeah. It is a Miranda. The stats, all the stats are very similar. You look at the FOSSA stats for the Miranda versus the FOSSA stats for the Brownwood. You look at the Jackal stats for both. They're the same size, shape, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I will note, I've circled some places where things are different in these two illustrations. These are illustrations that came from different artists. The one on the right is the Eric Christensen one from the Jackal's manual. The one on the left, I don't know where it came from other than I pulled it off the website. But it is not the Eric Christensen one. And I included it because there's a few things that I like about the one on the left in terms of the interpretation of the Miranda that we see there. And there's always been differences in the interpretation of the Miranda. And I've highlighted some of them. So at the top of the primary hull, you can see that exactly how the primary hull interacts with the top bulge where the bridge is, exactly how that interaction goes varies depending upon which one you've got. Exactly how high above the bridge complex the torpedo pod is varies a little bit. The one on the left is just a little bit lower. The one on the right basically totally clears. The one on the left is a little bit lower. The tubes are above it, but the actual bottom of the pod is not. And the most important difference between them, the most obvious difference, is the struts. The struts on the Miranda on the left, the engines are sort of splayed out a little bit more. They're a little bit farther apart. The struts on the right, it's more of a vertical connector there. I prefer the one on the left, which is why I put that illustration up. But I'll note that when you compare the Eric Christensen's Miranda to Eric Christensen's Brownwood, it's a Miranda. They're identical. The only difference is the toe pad in the canisters. So yeah, it's a Miranda. It's a Miranda. At least it started out as a Miranda. What's underneath the hood might be a little different, but it started out as a Miranda. Externally, they're identical except for the containers. So let's take a look at containers a little bit. So what do these containers do? Well, there's all sorts of ones. There's bulk transport, including major components. There's one apparently that's designed to carry warp engines. It can carry 3 warp engines. There's an illustration, and I think in Jackals it shows that you can actually fit a Constitution II class secondary hull inside the bulk container. There's a couple of different flavors of bulk container. Like the engine one is different than the other one. The engine one sort of has, it looks like it's got more work area, more like berthing, etc. The one giant one that can carry a secondary hull, it's just got like one row of office or staterooms or something along the very top, and it doesn't even extend the entire distance. It only goes about 1/3 of the way back, and so it looks like it can have some people on board, so you can actually go and do stuff aboard. It's got some staterooms and stuff like that. This is just a sort of a generic passenger pod. As you can see, if you look at for some reason, it's got a navigational deflector. I think it listed as being a main sensor, but why would you have a navigational deflector? Why would you have that? I don't think you need that. In the back, it's got impulse engines and a hangar bay. That's what that door-looking thing underneath is, a hangar bay. It's got a lot of decks. I want to say it's like 11 decks. It's got a couple in the circle in the lower left-hand corner. I've circled what are clearly the turbo lift shaft connection points. So you can just sort of plug it in, and the turbo lifts can go in between the ship and the cargo pod. That toe pad connection area there, it's got 4 magnetic clamps, and then it's also got some physical clamps that reach in down and grab it in the same way that the Galaxy class, when we saw the separation of the Galaxy class saucer, we saw the sort of the giant docking clamps. So, if you want it to be, if you've designed one of these pods, it can be basically a deployable sublight spaceship. That you can go tooling around the system. It's got antimatter, or it's got impulse engines. It's got power. It can have power. It can have water. It can have all the life support it needs, et cetera, et cetera. It just needs to be self-sufficient in those things, and you could basically dump it off. You could do it as a modular starbase, right? You could have multiple of these things and connect them together when you got to a place. You could use it as a sort of a mobile repair depot for stuff. You could turn it into a survey ship. You could use it as a colony transport. There's all sorts of things you could do with this, and you can imagine that a lot of these things would be very, very useful for a Miranda class to drag around with it, to deliver to a location. I can easily imagine a situation where a Miranda has like 2 of these pods. It goes to a location, drops one off, and it's in its own independent spacecraft. It's got all the survey capability, et cetera. Goes to another star system, drops the second one off, goes to a third star system, does the survey work that it's going to do, comes back to the first one, picks it up, goes to the second one, picks it up, and now it's done a complete survey of 3 systems for just the travel time is the only difference, right? I mean, it adds a little bit of travel time, but it's able to do something like that. You'll note that I didn't say function as a spacecraft carrier. If you go and you look at on Cygnus X1, have I mentioned Cygnus X1 before? It's got some really good blueprints on it. If you go to the Cygnus X1 website and you look, there's a set of Ptolemy class blueprints and a set of cargo pod blueprints. There's no Brownwood, but there is cargo pod blueprints. If you go to Jackal's Volume 1, you'll see that it's also got some blueprints on cargo pods, and they both have various things that have all sorts of spacecraft, including one that's a dedicated carrier. I just don't buy carriers in this universe. I just don't. I'm sorry, I don't. That doesn't mean that it might not be useful to have extra hangar facilities and have a bunch of runabouts. You could sort of use it as sort of a mobile base in that regard. But I really think that those are for scouting and survey. They're not for combat. So that's the sort of thing that these containers might have in them and why they might actually be very useful. Let's see. I'm going to go and take a quick look at some of the comments that we have here. So hello, Delon. How are you? Brownwood is the 70 station wagon version. Olive said that. I think I like that a lot. Patrick Ross says, I think I saw a model somewhere online as an unused DS9 ship. That's possible. That would be cool. I haven't seen one, and I did go looking for it, and there was not a whole lot there. I mean, basically the FASA website had some stuff, and the Cygnus X1 on the Jackal section had some stuff, and that was pretty much it. That's all I found. One Horshay said, can a warp field extend to that size? So yes. Christensen makes a big point of talking about how there's like special warp fields, et cetera, that do that. Well, first of all, we know the Ptolemy class can, right? So it can carry a big string. So there's reason to think that it can. There's reason to think Christensen basically argues to the degree that it's different, it sounds like the difference might be a different warp engine and field extension stuff. I would argue that you just build that in, and that's probably a software change, right? You're not going to win any speed records carrying along this thing because that cargo pod has probably a greater, in fact, I'm sure it's got a greater internal volume than the Miranda does. It's basically doubling the internal volume, and even though I personally believe that the warp engines probably are half the mass of the ship, that would still be increasing the total mass by, 50%, just carrying one of them, and 100% if you're carrying 2. That's what I would think in that regard. Because you can see these things are huge. They're 40 meters in diameter and 200 meters long and have an internal volume of about 250,000 cubic meters. That's pretty good size. So it's pretty big. Let's see. So I think a warp field can extend to that size. I just don't think you're going to set any speed records. And don't get me wrong, I don't think, if you're doing this as a Miranda thing, like you're not going to want to take this thing with you everywhere you go, right? You're not going to always have a pod. I'll get into that more later. Could the USS Brownwood been an original Constitution ship, lost the star drive, and later? So the question is basically, could this be basically a way of using Constitution parts? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think they're reusing the primary hull, because it's possible, but I think those primary hulls are actually new builds. I think they're new builds. Other people would disagree with that. I'm pretty sure that Andy Presby would think that because we had a long conversation today about whether refits make sense or not, and I think that they kind of don't. They make limited sense, and that's largely because the area of operations of Starfleet is constantly increasing in size, and so I think they're going to build new ships because they need to increase their numbers. And the old ships, they're slower and they are less capable, but they can do milk run sort of stuff. And you still need the hulls to do stuff, right? That's anybody who's watched this show for a while has heard me talk about that's why I think the Miranda was around for so long, is that it was okay having a second or third line ship that was useful for doing stuff like that. It was useful. Let's see. So I don't think it was probably taking old parts like that, but maybe it might have been. I think you'd have to make so many changes to the primary hull to this. You basically get half a primary hull and then everything else has to change. I don't think it works. If Starfleet only had 6 to 9 Soyuz class ships, would all have been built with connection points on the Miranda frames of custom ships. I don't know. I don't know how that would work. Let's see. Eric Henry asked, did the Brownwood come first and then the Miranda? That's possible. To be honest, I didn't look at whether there was any date information that talked about that. I think it's probably more likely the other way around, that they designed the Miranda hull and they said, hey, wait a minute, we can do something more with this. Because the Miranda is sort of the simpler design. How many hard points can be attached to Miranda vendor class to make subclasses? That's a good question. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And Dustin also said Enterprise might be the only ship completely overhauled from TOS to the motion picture that we know of. Yeah, that's the argument I would make. If Andy were here on the show with me, he would be making the argument that the Reliant was probably a rebuild also, and it's based upon a screenshot you see somewhere. And so hold that thought, because we're going to get into it when we start talking about canon and headcanon and stuff like that. Because it actually was very, very useful when I discovered this one particular diagram that sort of talked about canon, about how headcanon works. It was very, very useful because Andy and I were both able to sort of say, like, yeah, well, we're never going to agree on that because he's a level 1 and I'm a level 2. And so we're just never going to agree. Yeah. So what if Brownwood was a ship in the early Axanar? I think it's possible, but I don't think it's an early Axanar area ship. And so it's possible that it was converted to the Miranda subtype, but hold that thought. We're going to get there. Okay, moving on. So does this thing even make sense? Let's think about it for a second. Does it make sense to take this frigate or cruiser, whatever you want to call it, because everybody calls it something different, heavy frigate, heavy cruiser, whatever it is? Does it make sense to turn it into a tug? Okay, let's ask the question. Does the engineering support work? Does the engineering support this idea? I think it does. I think it does, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when I think it's on the a slide or two from now. We'll talk a little bit more about why there's a very good argument that it makes sense that Andy makes. And but I think it does because it looks like it's probably stressed for that. That's a very beefy part of the primary hull. You know, they didn't just hang it off the edge. They sort of put it on the real thick part of it. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think if you thought ahead and you thought about being able to do that, and we're going to get into that in the Canon side. Would that be useful? Yeah. I mean, it's useful to be able to move this stuff around. I'm not saying that they'd always have a pod with them, always have one of those containers. But, you know, if I could not build dedicated tugs and instead get more Mirandas with the idea that, you know, every now and then you just got to haul a pod with you. You have to haul one of these containers. I think that would be very useful. If nothing else, you know, if you had nothing else, you could do it, right? Even if you never use the capability, it's useful to have the capability in case of an emergency and you need to use it, right? I hope never to have to use my spare tire. And I've had cars where I never had to use the spare tire. I've had other cars where I had to use the spare tire. But it was useful to have a spare tire just as an insurance mechanism. And I think the ability to move this stuff around gives a lot of flexibility to fleet planners in terms of, like, you know, you don't have to worry about, I need the tug in two places at the same time. It's like, I got my Mirandas around, or I've got Brownwoods around. I can have them do it. Are there engineering concerns? Yeah. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I like that other Miranda design, is that it gets the warp engines a little bit farther away. And so, first of all, you know, there was sort of this semi-consensus, although I don't know that it was ever an official Canon idea, that the warp engines are radioactive and you kind of want to keep them away from the people tank. They certainly have antimatter plasma in them, so you want to keep that away from the people tank. But there was this idea that maybe you wanted to keep them away. Even if you think that it's perfectly safe to be standing next to a operating warp engine, you might want to have a little bit more space to make it a little bit easier to get the containers in place. And so that's why I included that other Miranda, because I think that version of the Miranda has the engines just a little bit farther apart and makes it easier to get these containers in place. You need to make sure that you're connecting it in such a way that you're not stressing the hull. So, I mean, it's going to have to be structural members. Like I said, you can't just hang this on any place. You have to think that through. So there are some engineering concerns. You know, they had to figure out whether you can make this work. Now, here's the question. In my head canon, right? I'm not saying I almost said the real world. I'm not saying that this is official Trek canon, but in my universe, the way I think about Star Trek, all Mirandas look like this. The Brownwood class is the Miranda class. So it's not so much that they replaced all the Mirandas, it's more accurately, they were just all built as Brownwoods. They were all built with this capability. I think it just makes so much sense that I can't imagine that once some engineer, maybe there's some early ones that didn't have that capability, but at some point somebody went, aha, and from that point on, it was standard. And empirically, that happens in the real world. Somebody has an idea, like when I was having a house built at one point, I said, hey, can you do X? And the guy selling the house to me goes, yeah, we should be able to do that. We're going to start doing that on all of them. And so everybody who had their house built after mine had an extra, I think it worked out to like 150 square feet, 300 square feet, because I said, hey, can you make this little change and sort of capture that space? And they said yes. So I think that's kind of how this worked here, is that they made a relatively small change and they just sort of standardized on it from that point forward. And so why build a dedicated tug when every Miranda can be a tug, especially since you can then save the money that you would have spent on tugs and buy more Mirandas. Mirandas are probably more expensive, but you know, hey, if I can trade in 6 tugs and get 3 Mirandas, plus every other Miranda can carry the containers, I think that's probably a win for everybody. In my head canon, I think they're limited to 2 containers because I think it's really excessive to carry more. You probably only did that in emergency. I wouldn't do that routinely. I think it's used when needed, and I don't see them going into combat with those containers. Like if the container is full of parts and not people, and they need to be in combat, they probably just drop it. If it's not, if it's full of people, they're probably not looking to fight if they can avoid the fight, because it seems to me that it is gonna hurt their performance in combat, I would expect. Okay, so let's talk about Andy's take, because Andy and I talked about this for a fair amount today. Andy's of the opinion that Mirandas are built to be modular, and they've got the big bays that you can stick stuff in the bays, but he also thinks that these greebles on the back, there's this weird patch, especially in the top, it's very prominent, but even on the bottom, you look at that and you go, what other ship has all this textured area, et cetera, et cetera. He thinks that that's some sort of module. And he thinks that they function as mount points, and there's basically heavy duty tractors in there also. And that as a result of that, there's a lot of fandom designs. Okay, here's the tactical frigate, and it doesn't have a roll bar, but it has this instead. And here's this, and et cetera, et cetera. And he's sort of kind of embracing the idea that the Miranda was really sort of a model kit, and Starfleet could build them however they wanted, including swapping some stuff out. And his thought is that maybe they don't go around with that toe pad in place. In my head canon, they always have that toe pad, right? That's just kind of what a Miranda is in my head canon. They're all BROWNWOOD. Andy sort of thinks that there's different configurations, and you can go into the shipyard and you can reconfigure it. And so the Reliant was a Miranda class in the Avenger configuration. Why the Avenger configuration? Because remember, some of the fandom produced materials called it the Avenger before we found out it was a Miranda class, right? We knew the name Reliant. We didn't know what class it was. They decided it was the Avenger class. There's all sorts of blueprints and stuff like that came out. Did I mention the Cygnus X1 site? It's got some really cool blueprints on it. And so he thinks that Reliant was an Avenger configuration, and that the BROWNWOOD is a Miranda class in the BROWNWOOD configuration. And you can go from one to another by just going to a shipyard and they pull those modules out. That could very well be. If you look at the bottom, one of those, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but one of those, the ones on the outside of those little, I've got the red boxes surrounding stuff. I've got the arrow pointing to the one. There's a couple of circles there. And you could easily envision that those are big covers over the access point. They're spaced about the right size. The covers are big enough that you could sort of say the covers get moved aside, and now there's a socket that you can plug the turbo lift access points into, and they seem to be about the right distance apart. They're not quite in the right location in the primary hull to make that connection work. They have to be inboard a little bit more. Once again, this goes to Canon. I don't have any problem in my head saying, okay, they're this drawing, they're a little out of position. They're actually in a little bit more. Other people would look at it and go like, well, that, good theory, Chris, but that doesn't work because they're 15 feet too far over to one side. I just ignore that. I'm inclined to think that that's sort of the point, so that if you believe Andy's idea that they reconfigure it, that's sort of like the mount point where they put in the toe pad and it all lines up properly. Okay, so let me go take a look here. Dustin says, could some of the Mayflowers have been converted to the Miranda subtype? I don't remember the Mayflower, sorry. External pods also help make Star Wars freighters make a lot more sense. Yeah, Star Wars just, one of my problems with Star Wars, you notice I never use Star Wars examples, right? Because I just don't try to analyze Star Wars because I think it's unanalyzable. But one of my problems with sort of the way that all the expanded universe and all the fandom and stuff has come about is Tatooine is the ass end of space. It is not typical. Yet we've extrapolated from the ass end of space to this is how the Empire works. This is how this, everything's a light freighter. Well, no, this is sort of like saying, I went to Sumatra and I went to a tiny port on one of the islands near Sumatra, and it had like these 3 very, very small ships. So that's what trading looks like in Amsterdam. Amsterdam's like the biggest port in Europe. Or that's what it looks like in Norfolk, or that's what it looks like in Long Beach. No, it doesn't look that way there. This tiny island off of Sumatra is atypical. It is not typical of. It's not the average, and I think that's the problem with extrapolating from Episode 4 in Star Wars, is that we end up with stuff that doesn't make sense. Let's see. How many torpedo launchers are directly in the main hull of the Miranda saucer? None. The only ones are in the pod. It's got 4. We've never seen any indication that there's one anyplace else. Sensor palettes and the like can look like greebly modules like in Voyager. Yeah, it could just be sensor palettes and stuff too. But I think Andy's response to that would be like they've always got beefy tractors, and yeah, those sensor palettes can be swapped out as well. So like maybe the ones on top are sensor palettes and the ones on the bottom are connecting hard points or something like that. What about Mirandas that don't have the weapons pods and the mega phaser? Yeah, there's a bunch of other variations that don't have the roll bar, like the Nox class doesn't have the roll bar. It's just got a couple of mega phasers that stick up, and there's other ones. In fact, if you go and look at the Eric Christensen stuff, the Jackal stuff, he's got a godzillion designs. There's a tactical frigate and a strategic frigate and stuff like that. And they're just all over the place in terms of the different options. There's another book that's designed. It's for the FASA game, and it's called like Ship Classifications and Types or something like that. And I counted up one time, and there's like 30 different types of cruiser in it. It's probably not 30. It's probably more like 20. And it's like a patrol cruiser and a diplomatic cruiser and a strategic cruiser and a tactical cruiser and an attack cruiser and a missile cruiser. And it's like, okay, that's not how the real world works, folks. In the real world, you have a small number of ship types. Relatively small number of ship types, and you may have more capability come in, and you may occasionally throw something like heavy or light, but usually you don't even do that anymore. The heavy cruiser, light cruiser distinction, I've talked about this in the past, but not recently. Heavy cruisers were created by the Washington Naval Treaty. Maybe it was the London Naval Treaty, the follow-on. One of those created I think it's a London Treaty, created the heavy cruiser. Heavy cruiser and light cruiser were specific things that were defined in the treaty. They were approximately the same size. It wasn't about the size of the ship. It was about the size of the guns, light guns versus heavy guns. It was whether you had 6 inches or smaller or 8 inches or larger, basically is what it boiled down to. And so before that, there was something, if you go back to World War I, there was something called a light cruiser, and that was sort of mostly differentiated from things like armored. Well, if you go back even further, you had armored cruisers and protected cruisers and unprotected cruisers and things like that. But the light heavy distinction is an artifact of a treaty, with the exception of light cruisers used as scouts in the World War I era. There was not heavy cruisers. There was just cruisers and some leftover armored cruisers from the previous century and light cruisers. And so having like 15 different types of cruiser, we would just call those cruisers. Like we had Spruance class destroyers and we had Arleigh Burke class destroyers, and we called the one the guided missile destroyer because it had Aegis and it shot missiles, and the other one was largely not a missile shooter in the same way. And so those are functional differences, but they weren't just it's not the way that it's frequently described in science fiction. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Okay. So Patrick says he found something in the X-Asters site at the bottom of the page on Miranda variants. Oh, okay. I need to go look at that page. I haven't been to that page. Okay, I'll go take a look at that. Dustin, I don't remember where the photon torpedo launcher on the Saratoga was on the Battle Wolf 359. I just don't remember. It's been a while since I've watched that battle. Okay, moving on. So where do I sit headcanon wise? Now, this is a slightly changed version, slightly modified version of a slide that I haven't shown in a while, but I've shown it many times in the past. We're in sort of explaining where I come from in all of this. The Star Trek universe has a godzillion different pieces of data in it, and they are not consistent. Even if you just look at the stuff that showed up on screen, it is not consistent. Did I mention that it's not consistent? And so what I do is I generally look through, there's a couple of things I use when I'm sorting through all this stuff. I use Sternbach and Okuda and the holy text of the TNG Tech Manual. I pay attention to what happened in TOS, and I pay attention to what happened in TNG, and I talk with Pat Doyle and Andy Presby. And that's kind of how I make the decision about how to think about stuff, or at least I find out how they think about stuff, and then I sort of wrap it up in my own analysis. And so, you can say, the first thing I would say is which Star Trek, because first of all, okay, TV shows, those are canon, right? They were official. Movies, they're canon. Tech Manual, is the Tech Manual canon? It's written by two guys on the show, written by the guy that designed the ship. I mean, the guy who designed the systems is telling us how the systems work. If it's not canon, it should be. Computer games, they're licensed products. There's a difference between a computer game and fandom stuff. These are licensed products. Role-playing games are licensed products. Also, do they count? Well, they sometimes change over time, but sometimes they have privileged access there. Like for, that's stuff that ends up in some of those games, like computer game stuff, online games, later shows up in canon. Okay, that's interesting. Things change over time periods. The production quality goes up and down. Was it later retconned? Did they ignore it, even if they didn't officially retcon it? How do we know these things? So in the end, I filter stuff through reading Sternbach and Okuda and talking with Andy and Pat. That having been said, so canon is what we see from an official source, but I think that this illustration here that showed up on my Facebook feed of all places at one point is just brilliant in terms of a good place to start on how to think about canon. So canon is what we see from an official source. Headcanon is what we, the fan, believe to be true. I would argue that headcanon is person specific. No two people have exactly the same headcanon. There are multiple approaches to it. You can think about it in different ways, and this chart is a really good illustration. So at the closest to canon end, canon, what this author describes in it is level 1 headcanon. It includes and builds around the pre-existing canon, and it can fill in the blanks, but it doesn't involve like an overextension of the material. Level 2 headcanon takes elements from the canon and explores them in a transformative way, and ignores some of the pre-existing canon in the process. And then level 3 is not rooted in canon material at all and sort of pulls in pre-existing fanon. And I love that last line, great for when a fandom agrees that the canon sucks. And so I would say that I'm probably a 2.5. I'm a level 2 guy, but I dabble in level 3. So you see where they overlap. And note that the overlap isn't consistent. Like the level 4 head cannon has very low overlap with level 3, but there's a huge amount of overlap between level 2 and level 3, and they even show overlap between level 1 and level 3. And so I think I'm right sort of squarely in the overlap between 2 and 3. And I would argue that Andy and Pat Doyle are farther off to the left. Andy is very respectful of Canon in that there are times where he says, yeah, that we don't see that doesn't work that way, right? We see evidence to the contrary. Andy's not really that willing to throw stuff out. Pat's a little bit more willing to throw stuff out. He will throw some stuff out. I also think that you could just call Canon as level 0 head cannon, right? If it didn't show up on screen, it just doesn't exist. There's no toilet paper in Star Trek because we never saw toilet paper in Star Trek, that sort of level. Okay, so how else might you document headcanon if you were thinking about it? So I'm a big fan of geek codes, and I'm sure that there's probably a few people in the audience that are old enough to remember geek codes. I'm looking at you, Bob. And so, yeah, Bob makes the comment, Discovery's canon is like level 4. Yeah, I totally and completely agree. So geek code was, and this quote here comes from the Wikipedia article. Geek code was a way that you could sort of add something in your signature block, and the idea was that you would talk about Unix and C++ and stuff like that, and you'd be able to basically give people your opinion on it by just using a code with pluses and minuses, et cetera, that would tell people what you were interested in and what you were good at. It's largely died out on the internet, but I find it useful in a bunch of contexts, and actually there's some stuff where I sort of use it as shorthand to myself about things. And I find myself creating new sort of variations of it all the time. In fact, even in my day job, I've kind of thought about, as using it as a way of sort of grading stuff, right? I could use it when I'm doing a war game. I can use it there are certain elements of a war game, and I want to be able to assign a value as to how well they did stuff. So in this case, I sort of threw together a very quick Star Trek canon geek code example. And so I will read it from left to right. It says, my conceptualization of it, it says that headcanon-wise, I'm a 2.5. I think that Gene Roddenberry's stuff, I generally have a positive opinion of it, but not overly so. Same with Franz Joseph Designs. Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach, on the other hand, they +++. Their stuff is just first rate, and I believe everything that they read. I am sort of hot and cold on some of the fandom stuff. It depends exactly on what it is. When it comes to the original series, yeah, it's generally good, but only 1+ sign. Same with the animated series. There's some interesting stuff there, but I'm not going to get wrapped around the axle about it. Movies are generally a couple of pluses. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened in the movies that is worth incorporating in my own canon. Next Generation is very high on that list. Deep Space Nine, a little less so, and that's mostly because of some of the stuff that you see in combat situations, which I don't think makes as much sense. For Voyager is problematic. It's still worth paying attention to. It's still got some good stuff in it, but it can be problematic. Same with Enterprise. I think Enterprise was way too focused on trying to do things like explain why the Klingons have 4 head ridges. That was also a problem with DS9. And so I think that there were places where it was just problematic. The JJ verse, nothing but minuses. Alex Kurtzman stuff, nothing but minuses. I don't pay any attention to the JJ verse or the Alex Kurtzman stuff. None. They do not factor into my calculations on canon at all. So you could easily represent how you view canon in a geek code, and if you had stuff like that, I could hand that to somebody else who was who had gone through the exercise themselves, and they'd have a pretty good idea where I stand on stuff, on what my sources are, how I think about that. You could do it as a 2x2 chart, right? One is like, what's your attitude towards canon? What's your attitude towards fanon stuff? Is canon required or not required? Do you have a positive view or a negative view of it? And you just got 2 columns and 2 rows. You could maybe even give a little name for each of those resulting cells. And you could probably put, most people could probably say, yeah, I'm in that cell or I'm in that cell, depending. I don't think that that's the best way to do it. I think the geek code actually works better than that. But I also like the idea of a triangular chart. Some of you may recognize that this is based upon Winchell Chung's chart. I haven't talked about his trilogy of propulsion, firepower, and armor recently, but that's where this comes from. But in this case, I would have, if I were talking about fan-in, cannon, head cannon, that sort of stuff, I would put the 3 corners as one of them is your score on cannon. How much do you think cannon is important? One of them is how much do you think fan-in is important? Stuff that other people have published, other fans have put together, et cetera, et cetera. And the third one would be, I just make stuff up myself. And so like if you're up in the corner where I just make stuff up myself, you can say, okay, that's great. That's not Star Trek. If you're not paying attention to any canon or any fan-in, it's not Star Trek. If you only care about stuff that other people do, I know that there are people that just sort of look at it and say, my version of Star Trek is Starfleet battles. The Starfleet universe, that's my version of Star Trek. That's what I believe. Or the FASA universe or whatever, right? They will pick a version of that. Other people ignore all that stuff. So I think there's lots of different ways that you can represent this stuff. And this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. I literally came up with all of this, everything here, I hadn't thought about until about noon today. And I started thinking, okay, how could I represent this? And I always go to geek codes on situations like this. I think geek codes are very useful. I really like geek codes. But I also use a lot of 2x2 charts, and I use the triangular chart also. So I think all that stuff works. One horse says that's a soil composition chart. I'll take your word for that. Okay, so here's my take on fandom sources. So let's because one of the things I realize is that different fandom sources they kind of fit into different categories. And so one of them I will call the big book of possibilities. And I think Jackals is an excellent example of that. Now, at one point earlier in this, you might have thought I was being kind of dismissive of some of the stuff in there when I talk about how he's got 15 different types of cruiser and stuff like that. And dismissive is the wrong way to phrase it. There's a lot of creativity there, and he's got a lot of stuff. There's a lot of very interesting stuff. But when I see this long list of things like that, I don't say, yeah, all that stuff is in Starfleet, and that's how they think about it, et cetera, et cetera. At best, I say the cruisers are cruisers are cruisers. There might be different classes of cruisers, but they're all the tough type cruiser. You might have exploratory as a word in front of it to indicate that it's got a big navigational deflector and the endurance and the speed to go boldly go where no man has gone before, whereas other ships might have another adjective or no adjective to emphasize that they're boldly going where we have gone before and it's not that far away. Or if they are, they take their time getting there and they're not running around doing exploration stuff. It's the difference between a Miranda and a Constitution II class. I don't think that it works as, like Starfleet has 15 different types of ships, but I do think it's an excellent catalog of possibilities. So I would definitely use something like Jackals if I was like putting together a role-playing game. If I wanted to design Starfleet, flip through the thing, go like, okay, they got this, and they got this, and they got this. I would treat it like the equipment catalog for an RPG, right? The U.S., if you look out there, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of types of assault rifles. The U.S. Army has like 3, maybe, when you sort of figure out, and like 95% of them are fit in one category, and then there's some odds and ends. And so just because there's a bunch of different designs doesn't mean that you have to have them all. And empirically, you wouldn't have them all. And so Jackals, I think, is excellent for just going and looking at the cool ideas, and it's got little ship write-ups, et cetera, but I wouldn't look at that and say this is a snapshot of Starfleet. I would say that, though, snapshot of a version of Starfleet. I would say that of things like Ships of the Starfleet by Mastercom Data Center, and Starship Design and Starfleet Prototype by Todd Gunther. Not Tood Gunther, sorry, Todd Gunther. It's not a presentation unless I have at least one typo in it. The stuff that Chris Wallace has done with stuff like that. When you add all that stuff up, those all try to talk about starship design and ship classes and ship types in an overall framework. They aren't just a collection of the parts. Like the Ships of the Starfleet always have a state of the fleet section where they talk about the big picture building program and how they think they need to fit stuff together. And that stuff, that is telling a much bigger, more comprehensive, more coherent story than something like Jackals is. You see the evolution of the type, not just the designs. And you sort of see how there's sort of things change over time and they flow from one thing to another, as opposed to just like, yeah, and then somebody said, we've got this highly specialized mission. Like we realize that we really need a ship where the captain's coffee holder is on the left side rather than the right side. So we're going to generate a new ship design for that. You also have deep dives on particular ship designs. You know, the such and such technical manual, the Khitan technical manual, the Olympus class technical manual, stuff like that. Blueprints kind of fit in that category. And then you also have the, how does this work? Every now and then you'll get something that's like, you know, Starfleet Medical. How does Starfleet Medical work? How does the bridge work? Those are, you know, technical deep dives, but they're focused on a piece of it. So I would argue that in the real world, you've got something that I would call radical evolution. We've had destroyers for over 100 years now. Destroyers date to about 1910, maybe a little bit before that. But the destroyers we have today look nothing like the destroyers of 50 years ago, which don't look anything like the World War II destroyers, which don't really look like the World War I destroyers. They're still called destroyers and they still hunt submarines. But over time, they've evolved in some ways that you've got something that's radically different than what you used to have. Radical changes in ship types are rare, but the missions change within the type. And that can, and technology and that mission change can lead in the long run to radically different ships doing familiar missions. So that's something that I think a lot of these sources kind of miss. On the right-hand side there, I sort of have my little summary of looking at something like the Brownwood and going, it's obvious, so why doesn't it exist? Well, maybe it does exist. That's one way of, that's a canon way of looking at it. Yeah, it does exist. Or, well, exists in my head. As far as I'm concerned, it exists. I don't know about you, but as far as I'm concerned, it exists. One is, well, it could exist. We don't see anything in Star Trek that says that the Brownwood doesn't exist, right? I don't remember them saying there's only the Miranda and there's nothing else that looks like this ever. There's, of course, none of this exists. It's all made up, so it doesn't matter. And then there's the other option of all of this exists. Whatever you want, right? It's a collection of things. Pick your poison. Everything exists. So all those work. I'll reemphasize what I said. I'm not trying to rain on anybody's parade. In my universe, all the Mirandas now look like Brownwoods. In your universe, you don't have to. I'm not arguing that you should change your universe. I'm just telling you why my universe works the way it does. Okay, so my take on fleet design. One of the things that when you get to things like all the Jackal stuff, et cetera, one of the things I think it misses is the role of requirements. There's a requirements process where the Navy or the Army or the Air Force decides, what do I need? You're defining what the right thing is to build. And the US process has been sort of suspended, and they've gone to a process that's going to cost us billions of dollars in cost overruns, because it basically decided to just ignore the fact that the current process works the way the current process, the process that existed until a couple of years ago, was put in place for a reason, to try to prevent billion or 2 billion or $10 billion overruns in defense programs. And they just sort of said, yeah, it slows us down. There's paperwork, so we're going to get rid of it. And so we're going to have $10 billion overruns in programs again. But that is, so by a requirements process, you're trying to define what the right thing to build is. How do you know that you got the right thing? Well, you need to figure out what the right thing is, and then you put it in specs, and then you do that. So how do you define what the right thing is? Well, it's based upon the mission. So I need a capability to do a thing. It's based on the cost. I can't spend the entire gross national product on one platform. I need to buy a certain number of them. I have a certain capacity that I need. And so, if I've got the absolute perfect thing, like we could call it the Trump class battleship, and it carries one cruiser's load of missiles that costs 5 times as much as a cruiser, then maybe I can't afford that, and I need to buy something else that has more capability in the aggregate. So you need to have a certain capacity. You need to be able to build a certain number of them. There's a threat that you're dealing with, right? You need to make sure that, like, if you're building up to fight the Klingons, you need to make sure, and at some point the intel people will tell you what the Klingon threat looks like. By the way, that used to be my job, not for Klingons, for the real world. I would tell the Navy what the threat looked like. I would help the Navy tell the Navy what the threat looked like. I'd help O&I tell the rest of the Navy what the threat looked like. So, it's like that could be summarized as, you don't want to build a ship that can swat down subsonic missiles all day long, but has a vulnerability to supersonic missiles because nobody told them that the bad guys have supersonic missiles. So if I'm going to build up in an era where I think I'm going to fight the Klingons, I need to build a ship that's capable of fighting the Klingons. And that means I need to know what the Klingon capabilities are if I'm going to fight them. And so that's the threat part. And then there's a context. And the context for Starfleet is their area of responsibility is constantly expanding because the Federation is getting bigger and the periphery is pushing out. I would argue in the original series, we saw a time of particularly great expansion. I think later on, things slowed down, but they're still clearly expanding in various directions, and they've got to have more ships to cover all that. So I think the Miranda is sort of uniquely suited for this, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. And it uses the same containers that all the other tugs do. That's going to also be important in a slide or two. And so I think it's very well suited for the mission of being able to move these containers around and being able to just do the rest of its job. So I think it actually fits in really well with sort of how my understanding of what they're looking for. I think I could write a requirements document for this. So how exactly would they use this thing? Carrying a container from one place to another, but there's a little bit more than that. So you have to spec out the containers too. The containers, in my conceptualization, they have independent power, life support, and sensors if they're supposed to carry people. Basically, if they're designed to carry people, it is a sublight spacecraft with enough endurance, and it should be able to just sort of like, they can just close the door and lock out the Miranda folks, and they're ready to rock and roll. And they should be entirely independent in that regard. Because at least in theory, if they're like a research station or a modular starbase or something like that. You're going to take them to some place and you're going to put them in orbit and say, okay, you're doing your job here. We're going to move on to the next thing. Now, if they're functioning as a freighter and they're just carrying, 10 billion tons of quadrotriticale, then that's a different situation entirely. But if they're moving people around and with a mission pod, then I think that's how that works out. I think in peacetime, ships moving forward routinely deploy with a container to be delivered. It's like, yeah, can your orders say, go to this place, pick up this container, take it to Starbase 25, and then proceed to your patrol area. I think that's how that works. In wartime, I think it's a way that, like one of those containers I think exists is a hospital ship. And, it's useful for your hospital ship to have warp engines. So, there's probably still a role for hospital ships that have warp engines. But this strikes me as a way that you can go close to the front line and bring, if you think you're going to need excess medical capability, like this is a way of, if you think a starbase is going to need more of whatever it is, this is a way of getting it more. And, if I'm heading off to the front line, I'm coming back from a depot from maintenance or something like that, I'm heading off to the front line, stop by, drop off the hospital pod, go out on patrol, do your thing. I think it potentially gives a tremendous capability. So does this idea work with other ships? The short answer is no, it doesn't really seem to. At least it doesn't work with ships that have the traditional explorer design, like the Enterprise. So as you can see, I outlined the pod, and then I put that next to a Constitution. I had it in my head. It's like, okay, yeah, they can just attach a pod. You could put those toe pads on either side of the primary hull. Well, like if every Miranda has these toe pads, maybe every ship in Starfleet has these toe pads of a certain size. And so you could just sort of put them off the primary hull. No. I mean, even if you believe that from an engineering standpoint, you can attach something that big to that location, and even if you believe that it's not going to cause some weird warping with the dorsal, like that you're not just going to accidentally twist the entire primary hull off by doing this, I just don't think that really works in that location. So I also had this idea that maybe I put it on the back, and I didn't really illustrate this here, but maybe it's sort of like nestled in between the warp engines. And if you kind of look at it, it's like, where's the connection point there? I don't see a good connection point. You'd have to have it extended far enough away, and your toe pad is probably going to be mounted at almost exactly the same place where the pylons come in, the warp engine struts. And I just look at that and I go like, I don't think that I want another structural member in that location mucking up the linear intermittent shaft, etc. I don't want it anywhere near any of that stuff. And if you move it farther back, now you're connecting on top of the hangar bay. And so go back to the show I did where I talked about how the hangar bay is all jacked up in some of the conceptualizations, and getting the size of the hangar bay right. You don't want to. The hangar bay is a big open space. There's no place to have the big structural members sort of go down to whatever functions as a keel in that ship. You don't want to just connect stuff to the skin and hope that you don't rip it loose. That's not how you design things like this. And so I kind of look at it and go like, yeah, it doesn't work on the back. It might work. If you look at the lower one, you'll see that the two circles are not at the same level. That's because one of them, I sort of in my head, I have it conceptualized that it's connected to the primary hull. The other one, it's connected to the side of the secondary hull. Maybe you could do that if you really wanted to. And if you put it on the side of the secondary hull, now it's the floors in it, or the decks are at a 90-degree angle. It'd have to be to use the standard pods. So that when the turbo lift comes in, the turbo lift has to come in sideways and then do a 90-degree rotation to be able to fit into the rest of it. But maybe that could happen at the top of the pod as part of the connecting mechanism. You can have that do that rotation, then it moves sideways because turbo lifts move sideways all the time. So maybe you can make that work. But overall, when I kind of looked at that, I said, yeah, I think it's just not worth it. I don't think it works. You look at the Miranda and the Brownwood and you go, yes, that just kind of makes sense. Let's do that. I don't think I can say that with the Enterprise. Incidentally, that gives you exactly an idea of how big that pod is compared to the secondary hull of the Enterprise of a Constitution II. And it shows you exactly why I said you could put a Constitution II secondary hull in there. In fact, I think there's actually a chance that you could get the secondary hull and at least one engine in there, maybe two. So I don't think that idea really works. That's the last slide. So let me go and take a look here real quick and see what's going on. Scrolling back, let's see, Patrick Ross said ex astra saying, yeah, I'm going to go look that up after the show's over. Yeah, One Horse Shay said, in fact, let me do it here. So first of all, let me do that. Okay, sorry about this. I'm scrolling. Sorry. I'm trying to find where I was. Okay, there's where I was. Okay, so here we go. One Horse Shay says the variety of ships within the same category could be due to preferences of the various member species. Yeah, in fact, that's actually a very interesting thing. In some of the sources, you've got Starfleet, which is, humans just we rolled all our stuff up in the Starfleet. We basically took our military and turned it, or our Starfleet became the Federation Starfleet. But there's some reason to think that the Vulcans maintain their own separate capability, and that the Andorians do too, and maybe the Tellarites. And so that there, at least early on, there was sort of a national fleets in addition to Starfleet. And, if you go back to the FASA stuff, in the FASA universe, the Andorians had a different conceptualization of what ship design looked like. And so they were largely crewed by Andorians. And so maybe they've got an entirely different categorization of stuff. If their doctrine is not the same, it would make sense that they would categorize things differently. And it would be useful for Starfleet to have some way to sort of differentiate when they're doing the mixing and matching stuff. You need to know the capabilities of the ship. But, it's nice to have rules of thumb. It's nice to be able to say, if you're going to send a package to deal with this kind of threat, you need to have an X and a Y and a Z. And if you've done your naming correctly, or your typing correctly, that if I pull one from this category, one from this category, and one from this category, I've met the requirement for building that stuff. So Dustin says the Kurtzman ships need to be stripped from the Canon. I just never put him in the Canon. I don't have to strip him from the Canon because I just ignore it. And, I should emphasize, because I, as a general rule, I try not to rag on JJ in public, and I try not to rag on the Kurtzman stuff in public. If you like it, that's great. I thought the first season of Discovery had some interesting elements, and I thought the second season did. And even though they ended up alienating me in the end and I never went back, I was certainly willing to watch it for a long time as just being like, this is an interesting science fiction show. This isn't, as far as I'm concerned, it's not really Star Trek. It's not my conceptualization of Star Trek. But you know, if you like that, hey, that's great. I have no intention of hating on anybody who likes something. Go for it. You know, go for it. I'll hate on you if you try to tell me that I'm wrong about my stuff, but I won't try to tell you you're wrong about your stuff. So I just never included it in the canon. So I don't know enough about it, even if I wanted to. Olive says he's okay with the diversity in nomenclature. Hey, that's great. That's great. I think that there's just too much of it, and the problem is like one of the comments that's been made is that with the exception of specialty ships like minesweepers, no ship class in World War II was used according to the directions. In all cases, they used them differently than they originally conceived how they were going to be used. Battleships, as a general rule, didn't fight other battleships. They did air defense, and they did, and they kept carriers from getting bushwhacked at night. So they could have fought other battleships, but they primarily, their job was air defense and bombardment for landings. Aircraft carriers were not the scouting arm of the fleet; they were the main striking arm. It's just the way that it works out. And so I think the excessive subcategorization ignores the fact that, they just sort of go like, that's a cruiser and its capabilities change over time. And, you've got a bunch of missions you're going to do, and some of you do better than others. And you might go like, I want to send a this instead of a that because the first one does the job better than the second one does, although they both sort of could do the job if they had to, right? So there's some optimization there, but as a general rule, cruisers are cruisers are cruisers. So in terms of, they do cruiser jobs, that sort of stuff. Okay. So One Horse Shade talks about last iteration of the RPG explained that the Kurtzman ships, the last generation of ships that had to use traditional and quantum computers in tandem. That's actually interesting. That makes me want to actually get the book that's in and take a look at. That's interesting enough. I want to look at that. Yeah, Olive also said, like I mentioned, how FASA in Starfleet Battles basically calls everything with a Marine barracks a frigate, even if it's bigger than cruisers. Yeah, I mean, so if you've watched me do the naming and typing stuff, I always sort of try to approach it as, this is how naming and typing works in the real world. This is how we think about it in the real world. But make up your own system. I don't get wrapped around the axle like some other YouTubers do, like Alex Clark is an example, or it's like, oh, well, that's not a such and such, that's really this. Because it does that's not a frigate. It does frigate is a term that's meant a whole bunch of different things over the years. It's a term that absolutely, in the age of sail, it was a small, fast ship that was primarily did scouting duties. It did light combat in some situations. It, piracy protection because pirates usually weren't very well armed. Note, not commerce raiding. I'm talking piracy. Frigates would go and do commerce raiding itself. And so that's what that job was. And then by the time of the late 1800s, mid 1800s, frigates, you ended up with like the most powerful warship in the world was a frigate at one point. And that's because the British said, well, this new steam warship is a frigate because it's only got one gun deck, and that's the definition of a frigate. And so because it's only got one deck, anybody nowadays we look at it and go, well, that's a battleship. Who cares that it only has one gun deck? Well, because their conceptualization didn't keep up with the times, and then they just stopped using the phrase frigate, and nobody used frigates for a while. It kind of popped up again in World War II a little bit. It in Corvette, people just beauty was in the eye of the beholder. It meant whatever you meant it, other than it was generally a small ship. And then there was a time period where before 1975, where the rest of the world said a frigate is a ship that's smaller than a destroyer but bigger than a Corvette. And the U.S. Navy said a frigate is a ship that's bigger than a destroyer but smaller than a cruiser. And then in 1975, we changed the rules on that, and we adopted the rest of world rules and redesignated a bunch of things as frigates. And what had been frigates, if they were on the smaller side, they became destroyers. If they're on the larger side, they became cruisers. So frigate and destroyer leader were sort of synonymous in the U.S. Navy for a long time. And so my take on this is call it whatever you want. I don't care. I do think, though, that if you're going to claim a naval heritage and claim that it does the such and such mission, you should think it through, and so that it makes sense that what you're calling it, you're consistent about it, even keeping in mind that real world navies are not consistent. Have a story as to why you're being inconsistent. Don't just be inconsistent out of ignorance. Patrick Ross says that it pretty much puts me in the center of the chart. Yeah, it does kind of, actually. that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I'm not at the level of I will extend into the I'm just going to rewrite it, but I wouldn't call it Star Trek. In fact, I even asked everybody I've got some thoughts on that. And I am very much aware of the fact that I asked on like 3 different occasions, hey, do you want to hear my thoughts on what I think if I were redesigning it? And I just haven't done that show yet. But it's going to include things like, here's a little preview of it. I really like this idea that came out before Wrath of Khan, after TMP, but before Wrath of Khan, that photon torpedo tubes are the weapon, and that a photon torpedo is created by the photon torpedo tube. So it is some form of, ball of energy, ball lightning, field effect that holds matter and antimatter separately, et cetera, et cetera. It is not a physical device that I load like a cartridge or I load like a missile into a missile launcher. I really like that idea. And if I were doing Star Trek, that would be part of it, and that gives you a lot of very interesting variation on like different torpedo tubes having different capabilities. And this one, in the source, and I still haven't found what source it was, it talked about how this particular torpedo tube fired a more powerful but shorter range torpedo. It just, the field didn't hold together long enough for it to get as far, but it was much more powerful. I like things like that. Okay, so let's see. Okay, scrolling down, looking for questions. Yeah, Dustin made the comment that he doesn't like camera spinning in Strange New Worlds. I am right there with you. Shaky cam is not my thing. Shaky cam is not my thing. It's the one thing I really disliked in Battlestar Galactica. I just got tired of shaky cam. Dustin talked about the California class. I don't remember that off the top of my head. So I'm not going to talk about that. More in the California. Yeah, Olive says basically go with all the canon that fits. If there's a conflict or something doesn't make sense, I start making choices. Yeah, I mean, I do not have a problem throwing away canon. I don't just throw it away to throw it away. I will go like, yeah, I don't think that makes sense, so I'm not, I can tell you why I threw a piece of canon away. I don't think it makes sense. I think it conflicts with this other thing, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just, I threw that out, with the exception of like the JJ verse. Okay. One Horse Shade talks about the soil composition side chart. Each side is silt, clay, and sand to determine the texture of the soil. Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. Wright points out that some well-made fan films are canon as far as he's concerned. I'm right there with you. Olive points out that one thing about Starfleet is they tend to be worried about all manner of different potentially hostile capabilities. Yeah, but you know, their gear is incredibly resilient. They don't really seem to be optimized. I mean, there appeared to be some sort of optimization taking place with the Borg because the Borg was kicking their butt. And so they seem to sort of view this as we have to figure out a way to beat the Borg in particular. But the rest of it, I don't know whether it's just that, you know, they were used to fighting the Klingons and so they just did the Mark 1 Mod 0 anti-Klingon routine, or whether it was just sort of like, you know, we just have this wide suite of capabilities and we've adopted a doctrine that works for us and we're going to use that doctrine regardless. And there's a lot of truth to that in the real world, right? You know, you sort of, you dance with who brung you and you build a set of capabilities that you're going to use, and you, that's what you train to. There's a phrase, fight like you train like you fight. And so to some degree, it's not as much about reacting as just like, I've got the thing that I can do that is generally effective, and I've worked at doing that, so I'm going to do that thing. And that sounds like it's short-sighted, but it's more along the lines of, if I'm a sharpshooter, but I suck at bayonet combat, I'm going to shoot. I'm not going to charge. It's that sort of idea, right? I'm going to do the thing that I've practiced and I'm good at doing that has previously been determined to be the right answer. I'm not going to just say, well, you know, maybe this time I'll do a bayonet charge. No. Yeah, One Horse Shay says Connie's and Miranda's considerably outgunned comparable Klingon ships. I think the Klingons sort of, so, you know, I can tell a story for that. And it could include things like the size of Klingon shipyards and the number of Klingon shipyards there are. It could include things like they generally only have one or two different types of ships, and so they just aggregate ships if they need more capability. They're a maneuver force, so if they need more capability, they'd rather just have more ships. And so if they think they're going to be dealing with a situation like that, instead of sending one ship, send three, and then they preserve their maneuver advantage in the process of doing that. You know, I can come up with reasons why you wouldn't, why that. We see an awful lot of one-on-one battles in Star Trek, and that's kind of weird in its own way. I mean, it's an artifact of it being a TV show, but I wouldn't expect in the real world, if this were real, I wouldn't expect it to be one-on-one battles, because I would expect there to be more going on in that regard. Yeah, Olive says the Ptolemy class is not multi-role enough. Yeah, I don't think it is at all. I mean, that's why I think that the Brownwood variant makes a lot more sense than a Ptolemy does. I mean, a Ptolemy kind of strikes me as being, by and large, a one-trick pony, whereas the Miranda can do that trick. And maybe it's not quite as cheap to build, and it might not even be as quite cheap to operate. But if I can do it with everything, if all my ships can do that trick, maybe I don't need, maybe the specialization I get from having a special tug that is going to be guaranteed to be in the wrong place when I need it. It's going to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Whereas, like, if I'm just cranking out Mirandas like they're sausages, there's always going to be one handy. I think they were cranking them out like sausages. I think they were getting ready to fight the Klingons. So Bob asks, any example of a combat pod, all weapons of these cylindrical pods? Maybe you can make the argument the carrier pods, where I don't think that that's the right way to think about these things, because I think if you're carrying this thing, you're probably not going to be very maneuverable, etc. You're going to be slower, and I don't think it's really worth it. I wouldn't view this as a way of adding combat capability. I view this as a way of providing self-escort for my freighter by turning my warship into my freighter in this particular case. So, you could potentially build a smaller pod that uses the same mount point and maybe has weapon stuff, or maybe you could like put a roll bar on the top and have a weapons pod in the middle of the roll bar. I think there's other examples of things where they sort of added capability onto a ship by having something modular that sort of plugged in and added stuff. And we see that with some of the Miranda variants where they do stuff like that. I don't know why I made Scotty cry, but I'm Scotty, I'm sorry. Olive said Tapoca class. I don't remember that one. I'm afraid I don't remember that one. Oh yeah, the Cerritos is the California class. Okay, all right. I don't think the Cerritos makes any sense whatsoever. I just don't. It's like I have to go through the warp engines to get to that pod in the middle. The one thing that we consistently see in Starfleet is people can get to every place. Crewmen can get to pretty much every place they need to get. So there seems to be this assumption that I'm going to have to do manual damage control at some point or another. And so there may be places where you don't necessarily have people in them all the time, like the warp engines, but there's an access tunnel that gets you to the warp engines. And so I think the same thing is going on, would make sense with, like, I don't like the Oberth class for the exact same reason. It's like all you needed to do was to put a tunnel down the middle, a tube down the middle to connect to the secondary hull so that a turbo lift can go down, and I'd be perfectly okay with it. So I just don't think that works. Scrolling. So Dustin comments about aircraft carriers in World War II. One of the interesting things is that, and this is based upon a very interesting master's thesis that I read. Everybody in the U.S. Navy, almost everybody in the U.S. Navy, thought that eventually carriers were going to be the thing. The argument wasn't, are carriers going to be the backbone of the fleet? The argument was, do they have the capabilities now? And arguably they didn't as recently as 6 months before the war started. Yes, I know that there have been carrier raids on ships at anchor and stuff like that, but nothing at the level of, I'm going to base my combat doctrine around aircraft carriers. And one of the reasons why the Office of Naval Intelligence didn't think that the Japanese could attack Pearl Harbor, despite the fact that there was this surrogate that took place in the war games. I think people put too much stock in that. A handful of planes with 50-pound weapons faked an attack. Everybody thought that yeah, okay, of course, I can fly to a location and drop a bomb. That wasn't the issue. The issue is, can I do a coordinated strike with enough airplanes to make a difference? And the U.S. Navy was in the process of figuring out how to do that in 1941, and the Japanese figured out how to do it in about September of 1941. So there's, and if you look at the Battle of Midway, we weren't very good at it. We got really lucky at Midway. But we had all sorts of problems coordinating the strike, et cetera, et cetera. It just didn't work very well. And because that stuff's hard. It seems easy, but it's hard. And so that was a real big part of that, was it took us a while to get to the point where we could do that. And so the difference between the battleship admirals and the carrier admirals was, are we there yet? And even then, you couldn't do that at night. It took a long time to develop a real meaningful night capability. And even then, if when the gun lines got in range of each other, it's all about the guns. The main thing that airplanes give you is a huge radius of action, for both scouting and for attacking. I did an episode on that a while back. Okay, scrolling. Patrick Ross says cruisers have been just doing cruiser jobs as far back as World War II. The destroyers largely sort of kept together in groups. They did. You didn't send them out to do commerce raiding, right? You didn't send them out on scouting missions, except perhaps along with cruisers, right? You didn't send them out by themselves unless you were really desperate. And there was a point in World War II in the Pacific where we were, in 1942 in particular, where we were really desperate. We did some stuff in 1942 that was just like we threw the book out. Sending battleships into the slot, the second naval battle, Guadalcanal, should not have happened if you had paid attention to the book. We sent 2 battleships with virtually no escorts into hostile territory. And it worked, but there's a reason why when Mark Michener later said something to Willis Lee about, hey, maybe we should do a night action, and he said, no, do not recommend night action. Do not recommend night action. So, he had won a night action. He had sunk a battleship. He said, yeah, there's too much luck of the draw on that. Okay. Yeah, Wright says Spock's brain in the last episode of Enterprise never happened. For me, it was the one with Kirk and what's her name, trade bodies. That's the one that never happened for me. Oh, and the one with Lazarus isn't exactly on my list of favorite episodes either. The one with the antimatter being. Last episode of Enterprise was appalling. Absolutely appalling. And from what I understand, Scott Bakula got really, really upset, and they noticed when he got upset because he was not the guy who normally was the problem child, but he was really seriously pissed. Yeah, One Horse Shay says Enterprise isn't canon, but an alternate timeline. Yeah, I mean, I went through the Starfleet Museum stuff. I really kind of like that Starfleet Museum stuff, and all that stuff is invalidated by Enterprise. So Dustin says something about after the Dominion War, Starfleet would need police boats and Defiant would be. So first of all, we don't know how big Defiant is. Defiant was the amazing ship that changed scale, and we don't know how cost effective it was to operate. We've gotten rid of some platforms just because they were too damn expensive to operate. And other platforms suck up a lot of resources because we need to keep them around because we don't have a good alternative. I'm looking at you, B-1 bomber. The B-1 bomber, last I heard, was the most expensive airplane to operate in the U.S. fleet because we don't have any parts. We never had a big parts locker for that bird, and they haven't made them in forever. So every time something breaks, a machinist has to make a one-off. And that ends up being really, really seriously expensive to keep those birds in the air. But they're beasts. They carry a huge amount of stuff. They're very, very useful airplanes. I wish we would have built 1,000 of them. But we keep them around because they have capabilities that the B-52 doesn't have. So, okay. I'm scrolling down. Wright says Mirandas are Starfleet C-130. Yeah, kind of in their own way. So One Horse Shay says, easy story that Katingas aren't significantly superior to D7s, but refit Connies and Mirandas are leapfrog ahead of previous TOS designs. I could see that. I'm not fully in favor of Federation triumphalism, but yeah, I could see that. So why did the Starfleet life support belt fall out of favor? I think that fits in the category of it's the animated series and they did some weird stuff in the animated series. Although I believe it is the case, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a Next Generation, didn't they have a thing that they wore on their arms that gave them like a portable force field? I'm almost positive they had something like that. Yeah, Patrick Ross says you could use cargo pods to carry orbital weapons platforms to a location you're expecting to be attacked. Yeah, that totally and completely works. I love that idea. I totally love that idea. Okay, I'm scrolling down, skipping a few things. There's a lot of things that I don't have anything to comment on. Yeah, Wright says we had the best gunnery expert on the planet. Yes, we did, and we rode him hard and put him away wet. Like he didn't ever rotate back stateside. He stayed in theater for like almost the entire war. Only at the very, very end did he rotate back stateside. Because they just wanted him there. This is Willis Lee. They wanted him there because he was so damn good that, you know, we keep the guy there. If we think there's going to be a battle, we can throw him into the battle. And as a result, we kind of burned him out. And right before the war ended, he had a heart attack. He was I think he was going out to his flagship from the shore, and he's on the whaleboat and had a heart attack in the whaleboat. And by the time they got him to the ship, he was practically dead, which is just tragic. You could drop a cargo pod at full impulse speed into a Borg cube while the main tug ship vectors off. I suspect that it would just bounce. The Borg were really pretty good, but I don't know. So in any event, that's the last comment. I hope you guys all enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much once again for coming and spending your Saturday night with me. I always appreciate that you're willing to do it. And as long as you're willing to do it, I'm willing to keep on doing it. And this was a fun one to do because, like I said, I was vaguely aware of the Brownwood. I've got the Jackal stuff. I remember seeing it going, oh, that's kind of interesting. And when I rediscovered it, it's like, oh yeah, that is such the right answer. I love that. Let's run with that. And so I'm glad I had an opportunity to think about Canon and think about that design and sort of try to tie it all together. And I have absolutely no idea what next week's topic is. I have to figure that out. But in the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. See you later. Live long and prosper. I don't ever actually say that, so I'll say it tonight. Live long and prosper.